The kingdom of Zawadi was a land of rolling hills, fertile valleys, and rivers that gleamed like molten silver under the sun. Its people revered their king, Chikandi, a ruler known for his wisdom, fairness, and the gentle steadiness of his hand. He listened to the counsel of his advisors, considered the needs of his subjects, and sought harmony among nobles, farmers, and merchants alike. But Chikandi's greatest flaw, as some whispered behind closed doors, was his trusting nature. He believed in the good in people, in their loyalty, and in the power of love and duty to guide hearts. This trust, which had been the foundation of his reign, would soon become the palace's greatest vulnerability. Queen Malika, his second wife and stepmother to his only daughter, Amara, was a woman of calculated beauty and quiet ambition. To the court, she appeared devoted, patient, and caring, tending to the king with a softness that belied her cunning. But beneath her smile and gentle demeanor lurked a heart steeped in envy and resentment. Malika had married Chikandi for power, for influence over the kingdom that stretched far beyond her humble beginnings. Yet she saw the king's love for his daughter as a barrier to her ultimate control. The girl, Amara, radiant, intelligent, and beloved by the citizens, was a constant reminder that the king's attention would never be fully hers. In the shadows, Malika began weaving her plot, subtle as a serpent's coil, silent as the night's breeze. It started with the simplest of acts. A sprinkle of powder into the king's morning tea, a drop of tincture in his evening wine, a careful rearrangement of herbs in his meals that made his stomach churn in ways that seemed natural. Each act was invisible, undetectable by even the most experienced healers. The king would rise one morning pale and exhausted, then recover briefly only for his symptoms to return, puzzling those who attended him. Advisors whispered theories of exhaustion, stress, or even a wandering spirit. None suspected the stepmother, for who would question the woman who appeared so devoted, so gentle, in every public display? Hints of danger were scattered like breadcrumbs, visible only to those sharp enough to notice. The palace, once a haven of security, seemed subtly altered. The water in the royal cistern tasted faintly metallic. The food bore the faintest bitterness that lingered on the tongue. Even the cupbearer, loyal for decades, seemed unusually nervous, fidgeting with the king's goblet, sweat glistening on his brow as if he too feared invisible eyes. It was as though the very walls of the palace had been poisoned by Malika's careful manipulation, tainted by her envy and ambition, yet cloaked entirely in the guise of care. Amara, the princess, observed all of this with quiet but keen attention. She was a girl of 12 summers, yet her eyes held the depth of one who had seen both wonder and cruelty in equal measure. Her hair, black as midnight, framed a face that bore the warmth of her father's kindness and the resilience that life demanded. She moved through the palace corridors with a grace that belied her youth, listening to whispers, noticing the smallest inconsistencies, the faintest smells, the subtle tremors in the behavior of those around her. Where others saw a simple illness, she sensed a hidden hand, a force manipulating events like an invisible puppeteer. Beloved by the citizens, Amara had a way of inspiring trust and affection wherever she went. Street vendors would offer her small fruits, children would follow her, giggling at her gentle jokes, the palace guards would soften their stern gazes when she passed. But to Queen Malika she was a thorn, a living symbol of the king's undivided attention, a threat that could not be ignored. In the queen's mind, the girl's intelligence, curiosity, and innate courage made her dangerous, for one day she might see through the veil, uncover the truth, and undo everything Malika had schemed to build. And so the stage was set. The king's health faltered under invisible hands, advisors whispered theories without resolution, the palace grew tense with suspicion that no one could name aloud, and the princess moved silently through the shadows, piecing together the threads of a hidden web. Amara's sharp mind and keen senses were the first light in a palace darkened by deception, the only force capable of confronting the subtle poison that had seeped into the kingdom's heart. Even as the sun rose over Zawadi, painting the marble towers gold, a quiet tension hung in the air. The throne was poisoned, not just by the subtle toxins in the king's cup, but by ambition, envy, and betrayal. Yet in the midst of this danger, one young girl's resolve began to burn quietly, steadily, like the first flicker of a fire that would one day consume the shadows and reveal the truth. The kingdom waited, unaware that its fate now rested in the sharp eyes and courageous heart of Amara, the daughter who would one day return the poison's voice to those who thought their secrets would remain hidden forever. Amara felt it first in small, almost imperceptible ways. Her father, King Chikandi, who once strode through the palace halls with strength and certainty, now moved with a hesitant shuffle, his steps lighter, his hands sometimes clutching the railing for support. The once bright gleam in his eyes had dulled, replaced by a shadow of weariness that no ordinary illness could explain. The princess noticed the subtle tremors in his hands when he lifted his goblet, the pauses in his speech where his mind seemed clouded. At first she thought it might be fatigue or the weight of ruling a kingdom, yet every instinct she possessed screamed that something far more insidious was at work. She began her investigation quietly, moving through the palace like a shadow. In the servants' quarters she overheard whispers that spoke of strange happenings: the cook who had fainted after tasting the king's food, the royal stablehand whose prized horse had inexplicably fallen ill, and the cupbearer who lingered nervously over each pour as if expecting invisible eyes to judge him. A small trickle of evidence, almost meaningless on its own, began to weave together in Amara's mind like the threads of a tapestry forming a hidden image. Even the cats and dogs of the palace, usually carefree and mischievous, shied from the dining hall, hissing at the air as though they sensed something unseen. The people of Zawadi grew anxious as well. Rumors of the king's declining health spread through the marketplace and the streets, whispers of illness, curses, or even dark magic that might have taken hold of the palace. Merchants whispered in fear, mothers clutched their children and muttered prayers, and travelers who passed through the gates spoke in hushed tones of a sickness that no healer could cure. Fear took root like a creeping vine, and though the citizens did not yet know the cause, they sensed the fragility of their kingdom. Amara confided in one person she trusted implicitly, the old royal healer, Maisha, whose hands had once saved Chikandi from a violent fever and whose wisdom had guided the palace through decades of turmoil. Maisha had gray hair like the morning mist and eyes that had witnessed both the rise and fall of dynasties. When Amara described what she had noticed, the subtle changes, the faint bitterness in the water, the nervousness of the staff, Maisha's expression darkened. "You are perceptive, child," Maisha said, voice low and urgent. "And that perception may be your greatest weapon. Your stepmother, Queen Malika, she has turned her mind and her cunning toward destruction. The king is not merely ill by chance, he is poisoned. But it is no ordinary poison. Beware, Amara, for this one is cunning. It listens. It learns. It carries a voice, and its voice can speak the fears and guilt of all who surround it." Amara's heart tightened. The old healer's words confirmed what her instincts had long suggested. The palace, the food, the servants, everything could be tainted. And yet she refused to panic. Instead, she moved carefully, attempting subtle interventions. She purified water with herbs, tested meals for irregularities, and discreetly warned loyal staff to remain vigilant. She rearranged schedules, ensured the king's cups and plates were monitored, and quietly observed Queen Malika's movements, searching for patterns or slips in her composed facade. But the stepmother's influence was deep, brooding, and formidable. Malika's charm over the court, her control over palace routines, and her ability to mask malice behind gestures of care made every step of Amara's work dangerous. The girl could act only in whispers and shadows, lest suspicion fall upon her. Yet in every cautious movement, in every careful intervention, Amara felt the poison's voice stirring, faint murmurs that seemed almost alive, like tendrils brushing against her mind, carrying echoes of fear, guilt, and manipulation. The substance itself, it seemed, was aware, probing for weakness, seeking to control more than just the king's body but the minds of all who drew near. At night, when the palace fell silent, Amara would sit by the balcony overlooking the moonlit courtyards, listening. Sometimes the poison whispered faintly in her dreams, voices she could barely comprehend, confessions of hidden cruelty, fragments of plots, and hints of magic bound to the liquid's essence. She realized that to save her father she would have to not only discover the source of the poison but also learn to hear its voice fully, understand it, and perhaps even turn it to her will. The stakes were clear. The king's life, the kingdom's stability, and the hidden balance of power all rested on her shoulders. Amara's resolve solidified, sharper than ever, as she prepared to confront an enemy that could manipulate the mind, taint the body, and whisper the very truths that could unravel the palace from within. The danger was real, mystical, and deadly, but so too was her courage. King Chikandi's health deteriorated at a terrifying pace. What had begun as subtle weakness and occasional fatigue transformed into a debilitating pallor that drained the color from his face and the strength from his limbs. His once proud posture slumped. The king who had commanded armies and negotiated peace treaties now struggled to lift his goblet without trembling. His voice, usually resonant and commanding, became weak and fragmented, trailing off mid-sentence as if his very breath fought against him. Courtiers whispered anxiously, exchanging worried glances, but none dared suggest the true cause, the cunning hidden malice of Queen Malika. "Malika, ever the portrait of composed care, played her part with the precision of a master actress. She hovered at the king's side, smoothing his hair, offering warm cloths for his fevered brow, and speaking words of soothing concern. To the court she was the devoted wife, the stabilizing presence, the guardian of the king's life. Yet behind her calm mask, her mind spun intricate webs of manipulation, blocking any attempt at outside intervention. Physicians summoned from neighboring kingdoms were delayed, misled, or dismissed on trivial pretenses. She directed the palace staff to guard the king's private chambers, ensuring that no curious eye, not even that of his daughter, could uncover her deceit. Every gesture of concern concealed an intent to tighten her grip, to allow the poison to complete its silent work. Amara moved through the palace with careful determination, acutely aware of the danger surrounding her. Each step was measured, each inquiry discreet. Yet even the most loyal servants hesitated, terrified of the invisible power that Malika wielded. Fear had spread like a creeping shadow through the palace corridors, muting the whispers of those who might have aided her. Some servants were paralyzed by loyalty, torn between obedience to their queen and concern for their king. Others fled the halls altogether, leaving gaps in the network of observation that Amara relied upon. The young princess faced an impossible task: protect her father, uncover the truth, and navigate a hierarchy built to silence her. Outside the palace, the people of Zawadi began to murmur in hushed tones. Markets emptied as news of the king's failing health spread. Mothers muttered prayers over the heads of their children. Merchants whispered of curses, ill omens, or dark magic at work. Some spoke in fear of fate itself, convinced the kingdom had angered the gods. Others, darker in thought, murmured suspicions that Amara herself might be responsible, a dangerous rumor fueled by ignorance and superstition. Even as the citizens speculated, they remained powerless, watching the palace's grand gates as though it were a theater of doom in which they were forced to play silent witnesses. Amara's resolve, however, only grew sharper in the face of fear and suspicion. Each passing hour deepened her determination. She had seen enough signs, gathered enough evidence, and heard enough whispered warnings to know the truth. Her stepmother had poisoned her father. Yet identifying the culprit was only the beginning. She had to understand the nature of the poison itself, its mystical properties, and the way it interacted with those it touched. The poison was not ordinary. It was cunning, intelligent, and, as she began to suspect, partially sentient. Strange, mystical signs began to manifest around the king. Liquids rippled unnaturally in goblets, as if stirred by an invisible hand. Plates and utensils trembled when placed near him, tiny vibrations racing through the polished marble of the palace floors. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, whispering cryptic warnings that only Amara could hear, messages carried on the subtle currents of the poison's voice. Sometimes the whisper was a confession from a servant, at other times, it was the echo of the stepmother's dark intent. The palace itself seemed alive with the unseen presence of this malevolent force, responding to the poison in ways that blurred the line between the natural and the mystical. Amara moved with a mixture of caution and urgency, employing every ounce of her intelligence and observation. She purified water, isolated food supplies, and adjusted schedules to avoid further contamination. She spoke quietly with loyal servants, guiding them to subtle acts of protection without drawing attention to her interference. Each action was a careful chess move in a game where a single misstep could spell disaster. As she worked, the young princess felt the gravity of her task pressing upon her. The king's life, the stability of the kingdom, and the balance between loyalty and deception all depended upon her courage and clarity of mind. The shadows whispered, the liquids trembled, and the palace quivered in anticipation. Amara understood more than ever that the poison's voice was not just a threat, it was a key, a guide to uncovering truth and restoring the kingdom. Failure was not an option. And so, with each passing hour, as the king's condition worsened and the stepmother's power seemed to grow, Amara's resolve burned brighter. She would confront the poison, uncover its secrets, and save her father. She would listen to its voice, learn from it, and turn it against the darkness that had infiltrated the throne. In that quiet, perilous determination, the first spark of her legendary courage began to blaze, setting the stage for the confrontation that would determine the fate of Zawadi itself. Amara's investigations led her to a startling revelation. The poison that had been slowly consuming her father was no ordinary toxin. It was clever, almost alive, attuned not only to the body it invaded but to the minds of those who lingered nearby. When she observed its effects closely, she realized that it absorbed more than the king's vitality. It seemed to feed on thoughts, fears, and doubts, weaving them into subtle manipulations that could sway perception and behavior. A servant might hesitate, a guard might falter, a noble might argue irrationally, all under the unseen influence of the poison's voice. The young princess had always possessed a sharp mind, but nothing in her life had prepared her for this. She saw firsthand how a whispered suggestion from the poison could make even the most loyal advisor question their judgment. Small disagreements escalated, alliances wavered, and confusion spread through the palace like a shadowy fog. It was not merely a weapon of death, it was a tool of control, a semi-sentient agent capable of turning friend against friend, servant against master, and even, if left unchecked, the king against his own daughter. What troubled Amara most was the recognition that her stepmother, Queen Malika, had not merely poisoned her husband in secrecy. She had bound the poison with dark charms, ancient and cunning. The venom had been imbued with ritualistic intent, shaped to think, to respond, to communicate in ways that transcended ordinary malice. It could sense anger, fear, and hesitation and respond accordingly. The more it consumed, the sharper it became, learning from its surroundings and adapting its whispers to exploit the weaknesses of anyone near the king. Amara approached the poison with careful study, not as one would a simple substance, but as one would approach a living, thinking creature. She observed the ripple of liquids, the subtle vibrations in cups and plates, and the strange quivering of air in the king's chambers. She listened intently, closing her eyes and opening her mind, willing herself to hear the faint whispers that others could not perceive. At first it was overwhelming. The poison murmured fragments of thoughts, whispers of guilt and fear from the servants, half-formed confessions from the stepmother, and echoes of the king's own weakened will. Yet slowly, through patience and intuition, Amara began to understand the patterns. The voice was not chaotic. It had a rhythm, a logic, a form of intelligence she could follow. She learned to respond, to speak softly into the presence of the poison, and discovered that it could answer in kind. It tested her, probing her thoughts and intentions, seeking to determine if she could be controlled as easily as those around her. But Amara's mind was sharp and disciplined, and she refused to submit. Instead, a bond began to form, a fragile, tentative connection in which the poison recognized her strength, her courage, and her clarity of purpose. With each passing day she gained partial control over it. She could direct its attention, uncover secrets it had absorbed, and even coax it into revealing hidden truths. She realized that the poison, once fully understood and guided, could become not just a weapon but a witness, a truth-teller capable of exposing deceit and corruption. She envisioned a future in which it might reveal her stepmother's treachery to the court, bringing justice to the kingdom without unnecessary bloodshed. Even as she learned to communicate with the poison, Amara sensed the weight of responsibility it carried. Its whispers were seductive, tempting her toward power, manipulation, and vengeance. She understood that to wield it safely she would need discipline, empathy, and courage. But the thought did not deter her. It sharpened her resolve. The poison was dangerous, yes, but it was also a key, a bridge to uncovering the full extent of Malika's schemes and restoring her father's health. And so, the young princess prepared herself. She would listen, she would learn, and she would master the voice that had poisoned her father. In time she would turn it into a weapon of truth, a force that could reveal lies, punish treachery, and safeguard the kingdom. The poison, once a tool of destruction, was now the instrument through which justice itself might speak. Amara knew that confronting Queen Malika and her poison schemes alone would be impossible. The palace was a web of deceit, each corridor and chamber patrolled by eyes and ears loyal to her stepmother, each servant subtly manipulated by the whispering poison. She needed allies, trusted companions who could act with intelligence, courage, and discretion. Moving quietly, she began to reach out to those she knew could be trusted. Loyal subjects who had served the king faithfully, exiled advisors who had once been dismissed or silenced for speaking uncomfortable truths, and even a few individuals from the streets who had witnessed Malika's subtle cruelties. The first to answer her call was Maisha, the old royal healer, whose wisdom and experience were unmatched in the kingdom. Her knowledge of herbs, potions, and old protective charms became invaluable. Next came Cato, a former captain of the guard, dismissed after refusing an unjust order, whose keen senses and strategic mind made him indispensable for planning movements within the palace. Others joined as well, scholars who had studied the arcane, young pages with nimble fingers and quick wits, and merchants who moved unseen, bringing messages and supplies. In secret corners of the city, away from prying eyes, Amara formed a hidden council, each member sworn to silence and loyalty. Together they began to weave a network of intelligence and support. Citizens, once fearful, began to recognize Amara not only as a princess but as a symbol of hope, a light piercing the shadow that Malika had spread over the kingdom. Whispers of her bravery reached alleyways, marketplaces, and distant villages, inspiring common folk to provide information about suspicious movements, unexplained gatherings, or unusual behaviors among the palace staff. Through this growing web, Amara learned of hidden entrances, forgotten corridors, and secret storerooms, each piece of information strengthening her hand in the battle against her stepmother. The young princess trained her allies with patient diligence. She taught them to resist the subtle manipulations of the poison, to focus their minds and guard their thoughts against its whispers. She instructed them on the signs of deception, on the way the poison could twist perception and turn friend against friend. Cato and Maisha devised exercises to strengthen both mind and body, ensuring that when confrontation came, each member could act with clarity and precision. They learned to anticipate illusions, to recognize whispers of fear or guilt that were not their own, and to protect one another from both Malika's schemes and the mystical influence of the poison. Sometimes, to Amara's surprise, the poison itself aided them. It whispered secrets it had overheard, exposing hidden traps, revealing clandestine meetings, or hinting at betrayals before they could occur. Its voice, once a weapon of destruction, now became a tool of guidance, an unpredictable but powerful ally in the hands of someone who understood it. Amara treated it with respect and caution, listening carefully to its murmurings, filtering truth from deceit, and using its revelations to plan her next moves. The poison, in its strange sentience, seemed to recognize her leadership and intent, cooperating in subtle ways without ever fully surrendering its own nature. Through this careful preparation, the purpose of their alliance became clear. They were no longer merely a group of loyalists seeking to protect the king. They were a secret army of knowledge and courage, bound by trust and shared purpose. Their goal was singular: to save King Chikandi from the insidious grip of the stepmother's poison, to uncover the full extent of Malika's treachery, and to bring justice to the palace before the kingdom itself could fall victim to deceit, fear, and manipulation. In these quiet, determined hours, amid whispered plans and cautious movements, Amara transformed from a perceptive young princess into a leader capable of commanding loyalty, inspiring hope, and orchestrating a resistance that balanced both human strategy and mystical insight. She understood that the coming days would demand every ounce of courage, cunning, and patience she possessed, and she was ready. The stage was set, the allies gathered, and the first threads of the kingdom's salvation were being woven under her watchful eyes. Amara understood that to save her father, to protect the kingdom, she could not merely guard against the poison's effects. She would have to confront it directly. One night, in the quiet of her private chambers, she prepared herself for what she had long suspected. The poison was not simply a substance, but a living, thinking force with its own voice, intent, and memory. The moonlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the polished floors and casting long shadows that danced like sentient beings. With closed eyes and steady breath, Amara entered a state of deep concentration, allowing her mind to open to the subtle currents of the poison's presence. At first, there was only silence, punctuated by faint ripples in the goblet she had placed on her desk. Then, slowly, whispers began to stir in the recesses of her mind, rising from faint murmurs to clear, deliberate speech. The poison spoke not in words alone, but in fragments of thought, emotion, and memory, each one brimming with the essence of those it had touched. It recounted the fear of the king as he succumbed to its influence, the hesitation of servants who had felt its subtle pull, and the anguish of citizens who sensed the creeping shadow of illness and deceit that had infiltrated their palace. Amara listened, holding steady against the tide of emotion, and allowed the poison to reveal its secrets. Through the murmurs, the young princess learned of Queen Malika's darkest intentions. Every hidden scheme, every cruel manipulation, every carefully timed act of betrayal was laid bare before her. The poison whispered of meetings conducted in secret, of letters intercepted and destroyed, of the quiet silencing of those who had once questioned Malika's loyalty. It recounted the queen's envy, her lust for control, and the meticulous planning that had bound the poison with dark charms, making it semi-sentient and capable of feeding upon the fear and guilt of all nearby. The revelations were staggering, yet Amara remained calm, recording each piece of knowledge in her mind as though gathering the threads of a map that would guide her toward justice. The poison also spoke of the suffering it had caused, recounting incidents that Amara had only glimpsed before. Servants had fainted from unexplained illnesses, animals had fallen ill under its invisible hand, and ordinary citizens had been caught in the ripple of fear and superstition that had spread from the palace. Each voice, each memory, carried a weight of truth and consequence. Amara realized that the poison, despite its danger, had become an unwilling witness to all the cruelty that had been inflicted, not only by itself but by the hand that had guided it, Queen Malika. Stepping deeper into the trance, Amara began to negotiate with the poison. She spoke softly, offering it a purpose beyond chaos, beyond destruction, beyond feeding on fear and sorrow. She promised it meaning, a chance to reveal truth, to expose treachery, to become a vessel through which justice could flow. The whispers shifted, uncertain at first, probing her intentions, testing her resolve and measuring her courage. Amara held firm, her mind clear, her heart steady, until the poison began to respond in kind, acknowledging her command and granting her partial control over its voice. In that profound exchange, the young princess discovered a new power. She could channel the poison not as a weapon of death, but as a medium of revelation. It could uncover hidden plots, expose lies, and reveal crimes that would have otherwise remained secret. Its whispers, once a force of fear, could now serve as a clarion call for justice. Amara practiced carefully, learning to direct its murmurs toward truth, to amplify confessions, to highlight deceit, and to illuminate the darkness that had spread through the palace. Even as she forged this bond, she understood the gravity of what she had undertaken. The poison remained dangerous, semi-sentient, and unpredictable, capable of turning on those who faltered in their intent. Yet in her hands, guided by clarity, courage, and purpose, it became a tool of immense power, both a weapon and a witness, capable of shaping the fate of the kingdom. The young princess felt the weight of responsibility pressing upon her, but with it came the exhilarating knowledge that the truth could no longer be hidden. As the night deepened, Amara opened her eyes. The chamber seemed unchanged, yet the air vibrated with the lingering echoes of the poison's voice. She had learned to listen, to understand, and to command it. The stage was set for the climactic confrontation, a moment in which the poison would speak not to deceive or destroy, but to reveal, to expose, and to serve as both weapon and witness in the reckoning that would determine the fate of Zawadi and the lives of all who dwelled within its walls. Queen Malika's calm composure began to crumble as she sensed a shift in the palace. Subtle at first, it was almost imperceptible. Loyal servants hesitated before delivering her orders, whispers among guards carried undertones of fear and doubt, and minor mishaps, once easily dismissed, occurred with unnerving frequency. The queen's eyes, always sharp and calculating, began darting toward corners, corridors, and servants, seeking some unseen influence. She did not yet fully understand what had changed, but she felt it in the marrow of her being. The balance of power had begun to tilt, and the instrument she had once wielded with absolute confidence, the poison, was no longer obedient. Paranoia seized her. Malika ordered additional spies placed in every wing of the palace, secret surveillance of her rivals, and even minor assassination attempts against those she suspected might have shifted loyalty. Servants were watched, and every meal and drink inspected, as if by sheer vigilance she could prevent betrayal from spreading. She tightened the palace's rules, instilled fear wherever possible, and manipulated the courtiers to reinforce her authority, attempting to re-establish the sense of control that now eluded her. But the poison, cunning and semi-sentient, was no longer under her command. It began betraying her subtly, whispering her darkest secrets, her manipulations and hidden plots to Amara. The very force she had bound to serve her twisted will now carried evidence of her crimes to the one she sought to suppress. Servants, once fearful and obedient, now found themselves hearing faint murmurs in the shadows, truths that undermined Malika's carefully constructed narratives. Messages were misdelivered, alliances faltered, and traps intended to ensnare the princess became useless as the poison silently guided Amara around them. The court, sensing the instability, grew restless. Fear, confusion, and doubt spread among the nobles. Some questioned the queen's decisions, others whispered about her intentions, and a few began to see the patterns of deception that had long been hidden. Malika's authority, once unassailable, now teetered on a knife's edge. Her attempts to suppress dissent only magnified the suspicion, creating fractures within her own circle of influence. Amara, vigilant and patient, capitalized on the unfolding chaos. Using the poison as a subtle guide, she manipulated events to reveal hidden lies and expose false loyalties. Minor betrayals surfaced, previously concealed conspiracies unraveled, and servants who had acted out of fear found their courage returning under the watchful protection of the princess and the whispering poison. Each step Amara took strengthened her position while weakening Malika's, and the queen began to realize with growing dread that she was no longer in control. The turning point came when a misdirected instruction from Malika, meant to ensnare the princess, instead resulted in evidence of her guilt being uncovered and shared with Amara. The poison, once a servant of chaos for the queen, now acted as an instrument of justice. Malika's panic reached a fevered pitch. She understood at last that the force she had unleashed to control others had turned against her. She had underestimated the intelligence, courage and cunning of her stepdaughter, and the semi-sentient poison that now obeyed Amara's will. Every plot she had woven threatened to unravel, leaving her isolated, fearful, and exposed in the very court she had sought to dominate. The day of reckoning arrived with a stillness that made the palace corridors hum with anticipation. Amara entered the throne room with measured steps, her mind focused, her resolve unyielding. The poison's voice pulsed faintly in her thoughts, a living presence that she could feel, control, and direct. It was no longer a threat, but a tool, a medium through which truth could manifest. The room's air seemed charged, the flicker of candlelight catching on marble floors and gilded walls, and even the guards paused, sensing the tension that had been building in the palace for weeks. Queen Malika, seated in the high throne, met Amara's gaze with venomous eyes. Her confidence, once absolute, now faltered at the realization that the force she had bound for her own power had shifted allegiance. Amara raised her hand, and the poison's voice resonated through the room, invisible yet undeniable. It murmured, then spoke clearly, carrying the weight of the truth it had gathered. Every secret scheme, every act of betrayal, every drop of malice Malika had orchestrated was revealed in vivid clarity. The queen recoiled as the words echoed in her ears, amplified by the poison, transforming her crimes into visible, undeniable evidence. The whispers grew louder, merging into visions projected for all present to witness. The suffering of servants, the fear of courtiers, and the slow, insidious decay inflicted upon the king. Malika attempted to regain composure, attempting to interrupt, to deflect, or to cast blame upon others, but the poison restrained her, amplifying the weight of her guilt. It spoke in the voices of all it had consumed, replaying whispered confessions, secret malice and malicious intent, leaving the queen exposed before the king, the court, and the people. King Chikandi, partially recovered yet still weakened, sat in his throne. His eyes widened as visions unfolded before him. Images, murmurs and revelations that laid bare the betrayal he had unknowingly endured. He saw the extent of Malika's manipulations, the deliberate poisoning, and the calculated subversion of his own household. He understood at last how deeply she had sought to corrupt not only his body but the very trust upon which his reign depended. And through it all he watched his daughter, Amara, standing calm, resolute, and commanding the poison without harm, channeling its voice into truth rather than destruction. Malika, in a desperate bid to escape or retaliate, rose from her throne. Her movement was frantic, her rage palpable, but the poison responded instantly, restraining her in a web of unseen force, binding her with the very essence she had sought to wield. Each attempt to resist was met with the echo of all she had done wrong, amplified through the mystical voice that now obeyed Amara alone. Fear, guilt, and the weight of exposure pressed upon her until she could do nothing but collapse under the undeniable proof of her treachery. The court and citizens, present in the galleries or summoned to witness the events, gasped and whispered as the truth unfolded. For the first time, Malika's deeds were revealed in full, leaving no room for denial or manipulation. Courtiers who had doubted themselves now saw clearly, servants who had feared reprisal found vindication, and the people understood the depth of betrayal that had threatened their kingdom. Through Amara's mastery of the poison, justice was enacted not through violence but through revelation, and the stepmother's treachery was laid bare for all to witness. With the queen restrained and the truth exposed, Amara demonstrated control, poise, and authority. She ensured her father's safety, channeled the poison's voice with precision, and allowed the kingdom to see the stepmother's crimes without unnecessary bloodshed. The throne room, once a place of fear and deception, now resonated with clarity, truth, and the undeniable power of a daughter who had mastered both intellect and magic. The stage was set for the final resolution. A kingdom restored, a father saved, and a stepmother held accountable, her deeds unmasked by the very force she had sought to command. The aftermath of the confrontation left the palace in a tense silence, the air thick with anticipation and relief. Queen Malika, stripped of her schemes and exposed to the entire court, had no recourse. Amara ensured that her stepmother was neutralized without unnecessary bloodshed, carefully arranging for her imprisonment in the highest tower of the palace, far from the king's chambers, or in some accounts, exiled to a distant and guarded fortress where she could harm no one. The stepmother, once a figure of fear and manipulation, was reduced to a shadow of her former self, powerless and stripped of influence, forced to confront the weight of her actions and the consequences they had wrought. King Chikandi, still recovering from the poison's effects, observed his daughter with a mixture of awe, pride, and profound relief. He recognized that the kingdom, once threatened by treachery and decay, had been saved by the courage and ingenuity of Amara. Her actions had not only preserved his life but had ensured the survival of Zawadi itself. With a voice trembling from emotion and lingering weakness, he acknowledged her wisdom, bravery, and resourcefulness, praising her as both protector and rightful heir in every sense of the word. The courtiers, too, bowed in recognition, understanding that the young princess had displayed leadership and insight far beyond her years. The poison, once a force of fear, death, and manipulation, was now contained. Its voice, once twisted and malevolent under Malika's influence, had been redirected under Amara's careful guidance. It now served as a guardian of truth, a mystical presence that whispered only what was necessary to maintain balance, justice, and vigilance within the palace. Servants and citizens alike could feel its subtle pulse at times, a soft, unobtrusive hum in the air, reminding them of the delicate equilibrium between power and responsibility, between knowledge and restraint. The very force that had once endangered the kingdom had become its protector, under the careful stewardship of the princess. Amara did not stop at merely neutralizing threats. She began a thorough reform of the palace and its administration. Those who had been neglected, silenced, or marginalized under the previous order were empowered. Advisors and servants who had been ignored or dismissed were granted authority and trust, their voices incorporated into decisions that affected both court and kingdom. The young princess encouraged transparency, compassion, and fairness, instilling a culture where the lessons of treachery could not be easily forgotten. Her presence became a source of guidance, and the people began to see not just a princess but a true steward of justice, someone capable of balancing power with moral responsibility. Word of the palace's revelation spread quickly through Zawadi. Citizens celebrated not only the exposure of Malika's treachery but the restoration of integrity and order to the kingdom. Amara's actions became legend. A young princess who had faced poison, deceit, and the weight of an entire court, yet had emerged victorious through courage, wisdom, and the careful wielding of mystical forces. Festivals returned to the streets, songs were sung in her honor, and murals were painted depicting her bravery and intelligence. For the people, she was more than royalty. She was a protector, a champion of truth, and a living example of justice realized. Even as order was restored, the mystical elements lingered. The poison's whispers continued, soft and measured, present but never intrusive. Amara could feel it beneath the floors, in the marble walls, in the quiet corners of the palace. A subtle reminder of the balance between power and responsibility. It was a lesson she would carry forever. That force, whether magical or mundane, could serve as a tool for justice if wielded with clarity, courage, and restraint. In the hush of the palace nights, the whispers were no longer a threat but a guardian's voice, echoing the promise that truth, once acknowledged, would endure. Thus, the kingdom of Zawadi began a new chapter, one in which Amara's wisdom guided both crown and citizen, where justice was no longer silent, and where power was tempered by responsibility. Through careful planning, courage, and the unique bond with the poison, Amara had restored both her father and the kingdom, leaving a legacy that would be whispered through the ages.